the death of a king. That's where I'm coming from this morning. The burial of King Joash. You know him. You haven't heard of Joash? He was king over all of Judah. He was known throughout the land. I'm Jehoshaphat. I'm Joash's aunt. He used to call me Auntie Hoshi. Well, you know what? It's been a long walk coming up the hill from where they buried Joash. So let me just rest on this rock for a moment, and I'll tell you all about him. He started out so strong, and life was going so well. I never thought it would turn into such a nightmare at the end. No one could have dreamed that it would turn out that way. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Our story starts when my brother Ahaziah was crowned king of Judah. Ahaziah and I were actually half siblings. We have different mothers. And Ahaziah wasn't supposed to have been king. He was the youngest of all of our siblings. But we live in this time of war and violence, and desert raiders came and invaded our land, and they killed every living heir to the throne except for my brother Ahaziah. My husband said it was because my father hadn't kept the covenant of God. He had worshiped pagan gods, and he had done great, great evil. And sadly, my brother followed in his footsteps. But my husband was such a godly man. He was the high priest of all of Judah, and his one desire in life was to see all of Judah give up worshiping the false idols, to return to worship the one true God of Israel, and to stop chasing after all those idols of wood and stone that they made. Oh, they did horrible things in the name of worship, burning their children in the fire, sexual orgies, calling it worship, things that the God of Israel, the God that brought our people up out of Egypt and rescued us from slavery, would never, ever have accepted as worship. Jehoiada, that was my husband's name. I called him Joe. He tried to warn my brother. He tried to tell him that he needed to turn back to God. He needed to bring the people of Judah back to true worship. But my brother had a stubborn streak, and he preferred to follow the advice of his power-hungry mother, Athaliah, instead of the godly advice of my Joe. And it cost him his life. Ahaziah only ruled for a year before he was murdered. And Athaliah, his mother, was so power-hungry, she couldn't wait to seize power. Can you imagine? She desperately wanted to rule the kingdom so much that she was willing to kill every one of the living heirs, every one of her grandsons, just so that she could seize power. I remember that day. It's emblazoned in my memory. I had gone to the children's quarters to visit baby Joash, sweet baby Joash. I was sitting on a cushion in the corner of the room, Joash cradled in my arms. I think I was a little intoxicated by the smell of new baby. And it was so soothing. And then suddenly I heard shouts and yells coming from the hallway. And Athaliah and her guards burst into the children's quarters. And I watched in horror as she raised a sword and plunged it into the chest of her firstborn grandson, who was playing on the other side of the room. It was chaos. There were screams of terror and gasps and shouts and the coppery tang of blood. It was as though this tornado of chaos was swirling through the room, and I was crying and clutching Joash to my chest and praying to God to help us, to save Joash. And somehow he brought us through the eye of the storm, and he brought us to the servants' entrance at the back of the room. Well, it was no more than this dark little tunnel, and I stumbled, gasping and crying, and I ran all the way to the temple, clutching Joash in my arms. And I didn't stop running till I got to the temple and found Joe. Well, there was so much confusion in what was going on. No one saw me come into the temple. And so we hid baby Joash in the temple, the only living heir to the throne of David. We hid him away in the temple and kept him there. Well, for 6 years, Adaliah's reign of terror consumed Judah. There were people who continued to go and worship at the pagan sites, but my Joe didn't. They called her queen mostly out of fear, but my Joe refused to compromise his dedication to God. And he continued to worship God, and we continued to hide Joash in the temple. And as he grew, see, Adaliah had no use for the God of Israel. She didn't come to the temple that much. And so Joash was able to grow and stay in seclusion. And as he grew up, Joe taught him and Zechariah, our son, and all of our other sons, the law of God and the love of God. And God protected us from Adaliah's spies. And throughout those years, Joe prayed fervently for an opportunity to overthrow Adaliah and her reign of terror and to restore the rightful heir to the throne of David, someone who would honor God and restore true worship to Judah again. And the opportunity came in our 7th year of seclusion. See, there were some people who continued to worship the true God of Israel. They would still come to the temple, sometimes at risk of their very lives, but they still came and worshiped God in the temple. I remember the whispered meetings. Joe would invite them to our home at night, and I remember men crouched around the oil lamp on our dirt floor, whispered conversations, fervently praying to God. I would serve them bread and cheese in those meetings and listen as they prayed to God to know who to trust. Who could they trust in the land of Judah? And then one night, God gave them a plan. And so they sent out word to all the Levitical priests, all the priests who continued to remain faithful and serve in the temple. They put out a call and they asked them to come to the temple this one night to meet. And they didn't know if anyone would come. They didn't know if Adaliah's spies would find out about it. But Joe told me after they came. They all came out of faith in God. And Joe said they made a covenant with God that night, right there in the temple, to restore God's rightful ruler to the throne, someone who would bring back proper worship to Judah so that the glory of God could dwell once again in the temple. Now, I won't bore you with all the military details. To be honest, I'm not sure I really understand them myself. But whatever plan God gave those men, it worked. On the appointed Sabbath day, when everyone was gathered together in the temple to worship God, Joe brought little 7-year-old Joash out among the faithful people. Oh, he was surrounded by bodyguards bristling with swords to protect him. No one was getting close to harm Joash that day. But you know, as I watched the faces of those people, I saw something I hadn't seen in so long: hope. See, when Athaliah had gone on her rampage and killed all of her grandsons, the hope of Israel had gone out. There was no one left to fulfill God's promise, no one to sit on the throne of David anymore. But now, here they were in the temple, seeing Joash there, the rightful heir to the throne of Judah. And I saw hope rekindled in people's eyes for the first time in 7 years. It was an amazing sight, and it was such a proud day for me as I watched my husband and Zechariah, my son, crowned my 7-year-old nephew king over all Judah. It was an amazing day. Joe had arranged a full-on coronation and renewal of the covenant with God and the people of Israel with music and singing, and we danced to the Lord in the temple that day. Oh, we sang and we worshiped, and it was amazing. Well, it wasn't long before Athaliah got wind of what was going on. And she came rushing into the temple, tearing at her clothes, screaming, "Treason! Treason!" And as I watched, I thought for a moment people were going to turn tail and run. But Joe had set guards all around the temple gates, and they arrested Athaliah, and they dragged her screaming from the temple. And she was executed that same day for her evil ways. Well, that marked the beginning of peace and prosperity for the city of Jerusalem and for the land of Judah. Joe and my sons helped Joash when he was young to tear down all of the pagan altars everywhere where they worshiped false gods, and they began to rebuild the temple. And as Joash grew, my Joe instructed him on the ways of God. He taught Joash and Zechariah, our son, side by side in true worship of God. And Joash continued to honor God as he got older. He would come to my Joe. Joe would tell me how he would come to him and he would ask him the questions. Is this honoring to God? Is this the will of God? He always wanted to do what was honoring in God's eyes. And he began to rebuild the temple. It had fallen into disrepair, and there was a lot of work needed. And so he put out a call to all of the people throughout the land of Judah to bring offerings the way Moses had instructed our people so long ago. And they did. They responded, and it was overwhelming. As we sat around our cooking fire at night talking, Joe told me the response was so overwhelming. There was even enough left to replace all of the utensils and the bowls and everything that we used in all of our worship rituals. And the aroma of pleasing offerings to God drifted across the city of Jerusalem once again. And life was good. Life was good for a long, long time. Until Joe died. You know, he was 130 years old when he died. And he always took his job as high priest so seriously. Everything he said or did, he did to honor God. And because he honored God in life, the people of Judah honored him in death. Do you know they buried my Joe, my Jehoiada? They buried him in the royal cemetery with the kings. I'm so proud of the godly man that my husband was. Well, it wasn't too long after that things took a turn for the worse. I'm not really sure what happened, but one day I saw Joash meeting and talking with these group of men who weren't believers. They didn't follow our God. And I noticed he was starting to spend more time with them, and he was spending less time with my sons, with Zechariah and his brothers who were priests in the temple, and less he came to them. And I wondered what was wrong. They had played together as boys, they had grown up together, and as men they had worked side by side with my husband to restore the temple. I didn't understand what was happening, and I tried to talk to him. I was his Auntie Hoshi. Surely he'd listen to me. But Joash didn't want anything to do with me. He cut me out of his life, just like he had cut out every other person who continued to follow the God of Israel. Well, my son Zechariah couldn't stand the thought of seeing Judah fall back into false worship again, and he prayed to God, and God moved in his heart, and he confronted Joash. He said, "Why are you deliberately turning away from the commandments of God? You can't live this way. If you turn away from God, he'll turn away from you." And Joash didn't like the message from God that Zechariah delivered. He schemed together with his cohorts, and my own nephew gave the command to murder my son Zechariah. They stoned him to death in the temple court, the same court where we had crowned Joash king. My family had crowned him king so many years before. And I still remember Zechariah's last words. They haunt me sometimes. He cried out, "May the Lord see this and avenge it." And God did. It was less than a year when an army from the northeast came and invaded Judah. It was a small army. It should have been no match for our army. But God was avenging the fact that Joash didn't follow him anymore. And our army was defeated, and Joash was seriously wounded. It wasn't fatal. But as he lay in his bed recovering, his servants killed him in his sleep. And they told me later it was to avenge my Zechariah's death. And so here I am, returning from a burial of a king. Oh, it was nothing like my Joe's burial, full of honor. See, the people of Judah knew that Joash hadn't honored God in his life, and they didn't honor Joash in his death. Do you know he wasn't even buried in the royal cemetery with the other kings? They buried him somewhere else. It didn't have to be this way. It shouldn't be this way. So much pain and sorrow, so much grief and suffering and loss. If only he hadn't stopped asking the question, is this honoring to God? Are the people I'm getting advice from seeking God? I don't know why he stopped asking those questions. He just did. It matters, you know. It really matters what questions we're asking. Maybe if he kept asking those questions, I wouldn't be coming back from a burial today. Maybe I'd be telling you a different story. What questions are you asking? Are you asking, is this honoring God? And who are you getting advice from? Are the people you're going to seeking God's will? It really matters.